everyone, Madilynn Dale here, the Chapter Goddess. I am a mom, author, blogger, freelancer, podcaster, producer, and overall creative. With this show, I really want to focus on creatives and bring their authentic self to life. How are they motivated to pursue their passions? What have been the struggles along the way? Does self-care play an important role in who they are today and how they connect with the creative flow? Bringing one's authentic self to the forefront is important in this world that we live in currently. Sharing your self-care, your tips, and how you stay on track for things without losing it completely is also important. Self-care is not talked about enough, and authenticity and self-care are what I like to highlight with my creatives, as well as getting to know them. So get ready for a fun and entertaining show. Hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and let's get ready to meet this episode's guest. Today's episode is sponsored by Creative Edge Publicity. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode with the Chapter Goddess. We are going to be chatting with an author today about him and his work and all his creative endeavors. So without further ado, let me bring him in and I'll let him introduce himself and then we'll dive right in.
Hi, I guess I'm up.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Ben Monroe. I'm an author from Northern California in the San Francisco Bay Area region. I've lived here most of my life. I write horror stories of various sorts. And I guess that's a pretty quick intro for me.
Nice. So I'm going to kind of dive into the horror aspect because that's a fun genre. There's so
Absolutely.
many fun horror ideas. What drew you to that originally?
I don't know. It's funny. As long as I can remember, I've loved two things: reading and monsters. I've got a picture that my mom saved from when I was little in nursery school, where I guess I had just seen the Lon Chaney Wolfman movie.
Ooh.
Lon Chaney Jr. Sorry, to be specific, the Wolfman movie. And in like a 3 or 4 years old, drew this picture of the Wolfman, and I was describing to the teacher, like, what the plot of the Wolfman was. And I think, in my 3 or 4 year old understanding, the plot was a man got bitten by a wolf. Now he's a Wolfman, right?
Oh, yay.
And I just thought that was neat. And I remember being a little bit older, same age, when I was old enough to walk down to the local comic book store buying comics. And my favorite one was the Classics Illustrated version of the Odyssey.
Ooh.
And I just remember loving, the Cyclops and Scylla and Charybdis and all these cool monsters that were in that. And from there, it kind of snowballed from there, loving, all the old Universal classics, Frankenstein, Wolfman. As a teenager, I got into more modern horror movies, The Exorcist. It wasn't really modern when I was a teenager. It was a little bit old by then. Night of the Living Dead, all the really, more modern, squishy stuff. And so, yeah, I've always loved monsters.
Yes. No, that actually makes me happy to hear that it started showing up at such a young age for you. Because my son is also really big about his monsters, and he's 5. So
Nice.
He's been like that since I can't even remember. So
What's his favorite monster?
Oh man, he likes he calls it the wizard, but it's like a mashup of like a dragon, a wizard, a lizard because it's got like lizard abilities.
Nice.
And those people get to it, and like antlers or something. It's like this monster he's created in his mind.
I love it.
Stuff, and I'm just like, yes,
Absolutely.
That's
great.
Encouraging him to embrace that creative side because I mean, as an author and like results in you too as well, like all that creativity with all the monsters has come and aided you later in life in writing, right?
Right. Absolutely.
So that's, yes, That makes me very happy. So with your horror stuff, do you lean towards like the cleaner experiences or the super gory?
Um, I tend to like to build suspense. You know, things happen slowly, methodically, keep happening, and things get worse and worse. And then I like to use gore almost as a punctuation. You know,
Yeah.
where in a sentence you would have, you know, verbs and subjects and everything, and then an exclamation point at the end. You know, that's where the gore comes in. I
Okay.
think it can be used well for, you know, a point, but I don't like to over rely on it.
Hmm. That's a good aspect for writing. With your horror and stuff, when did you start writing like your first actual horror story? Do you remember kind of close to what age instead of like a fantasy story?
I do. It's kind of weird because as a working author now, I really only started writing fiction professionally really in the last 5 or 6 years. I kind of noodled with it, fiddled around. Before that, I did work as like a copywriter and a technical writer, and did some um, uh, editorial work for small companies that weren't really in, you know, the creative field. Just, you know,
Mhm.
noodling around there. But as far as, you know, playing with it, um, gosh, I mean, I remember specifically writing a couple of stories as early as in high school. Uh, you know, and they always had a monster theme to them. You know, I'm one of them. I'm remembering we had an assignment, write a story that used color, right? And we had to put colors into the story. I wrote the story about these guys, you know, going on a camping trip in the woods, and they come across a swamp, and there's a monster, and the monster's bad, does bad
Ooh.
monster things to them, and trying to get all those colors into it. And actually, one of the funny things I remember at the time was then we had to get up and read in front of the class, which is, you know, one of my least favorite things to do.
Yeah.
And and I got a lot of feedback from the other students. They basically said, "Well, you didn't use any colors. It was the story was too scary, and you didn't use any of the colors that we were given." And the teacher stopped. She's like, "Whoa, hang on a second. He had every color that you had asked, you know, that would had been in the assignment integrated into the story. But apparently, I'm kind of crowing here a little bit. My story was engaging enough and scary enough that they were more engaged with the story and not listening for the actual point of the assignment. So that was pretty good,
Yeah, and it's totally not a bad thing either.
right?
So,
Because they
oh,
were wrapped up in what I was doing. So that
yeah,
was
they
neat,
just kind of it was kind of created the story in their mind versus them just hearing those specific things. Oh, I
right?
love it. That's how you know you're a good storyteller. So,
I think so.
yeah. Do
And
you
it took.
do you
I'm
feel
sorry.
like
Go
you've
ahead.
kind of built on that? Sorry.
That's the problem with these virtual chats. You're never quite sure who's talking next.
It's true.
Um, I have, you know, I spent some time working in the tabletop role playing game field. I wrote some
Mhm.
adventures and things there, uh, full time for a while, and then as a freelancer for a while. And I played a lot of those games growing up as well. And so I always, even when I wasn't writing, you know, in that before I started doing it really seriously a few years ago, I always consider myself a storyteller. You know, I always enjoyed getting my group of friends together and working out these scenarios that you do in a role playing game, coming up with the plots and doing all that kind of stuff. And I think that served me well, actually, even though I wasn't writing when I was doing that, because, you know, when you're essentially with some friends riffing a story, just going along with it, you're looking at them all around the table and seeing what's engaging them and what they're losing interest in. And I think I was able to take that to my writing later. Uh, so
Yeah. That is a very good thing to take away. I've known several authors have pulled a lot of their ideas and kind of like inspiration from tabletop games, specifically more
mhm,
so that I've heard is D&D. So,
right.
and was that one you ever played?
Oh yeah, yeah. That was where, you know, when in my generation, that's where everyone started, and then we moved on. Some of us moved on to other things, and I played so many different games back then.
Yeah. It's amazing the inspiration that comes from that game.
Oh
So,
yeah.
I'm going to shift us a little bit and let's talk about your latest release, ah, latest release, The Seething.
Uh-huh.
Tell me a little bit about that. What's it about?
So this evening, I would make the joke. It's about 375 pages. Haha, dad joke right there. This evening is about a family going on vacation to a small town in northern Sierra Nevadas, Northern California mountains, um, and things start to go poorly. we find out pretty early on that the teenage daughter of the family, Kimmy, is sort of latently psychic. She's got some interesting senses that she can do. Nothing as extreme as like a Carrie or a fire starter kind of thing, but she finds stuff that's been lost sometimes and has weird hunches. And there's this thing in the surrounding area that kind of latches onto her ability and figures out a way that it can use her for its schemes, which are essentially to escape the area that it's been trapped in for many years. If it can maybe use her in certain ways. So,
Ooh.
And then everything goes downhill from there.
Man, so I take it he does escape a little bit then, and they have to put him back, or maybe not?
A little bit.
Oh. Where did the inspiration for this story stem from?
Oh gosh, it's funny when I was working on the thing. I just finished my first novel. I was writing a bunch of short stories. I knew I want to jump on another book. I had so much fun writing the first one that I really want to keep doing this. This is really fun. And one of the things I'd found was really helping in my creative goals, my essentially recharging my creative self, was getting out of the house, going for hikes, going for runs in the trails nearby, just change of scenery. At the time, we were experiencing a pretty extreme couple of years of drought here in the Bay Area, Northern California. It was getting pretty bad. And there's a lake. I'm pointing. Sorry, I'm a handsy.
You're good. You are good. I get that.
There's a lake a couple miles east of my house, which I was running around and hiking around a lot, a man-made lake. And I was noticing over a couple months that the water level was getting lower and lower and lower. They have these little, floating docks that people can fish off of, or, put their, drive their boats up to when they're tooling around the lake. And I remember at some point seeing those docks had actually gotten to the point where they were like right on the ground. The lake had receded so far that there was just dirt there. And I don't know why this thought popped into my head, but I was thinking, suddenly came up, if there was a monster in that lake, it's a lot closer to the surface now. It's gonna be a lot easier for it to get people.
Yeah.
And so then I started thinking about, the ecological damage that was happening to that little lake ecosystem. There are herons and snakes and all kinds of birds and lizards and critters there. And I was thinking, boy, if I was an angry monster who'd been trapped in this lake for a long time, and suddenly, my ecology, my ecosystem was collapsing, what might it do to get out? What might it do to escape that area and try to find someplace else to inhabit? And so those are some of the initial thoughts that got me moving on this story. They don't necessarily all, come up in the tale, but that was definitely where I was starting from.
Oh, that is fun. When you created the monster, did you go with an idea that's been used in the past to kind of build him, or did you kind of pull your own stuff to create his physical appearance and everything else with him?
It was sort of whole cloth. The monster itself actually came to me in a nightmare, which I don't have very often, which is kind of fun. So when I have one, I remember it. I'm like, ooh, I should make a note of that quick. And in this nightmare, I was doing something completely innocuous. I don't remember the beginning. I was like cooking dinner or, cleaning the bathroom or something. And I noticed a black spot on the wall. And as I watched it, the spot started like spider webbing out, like growing in like weird, strange ways. And then, the spot got bigger. And what I realized was that it wasn't just like a spot mold or something. It was an absence of reality is really the only way I can explain it. Like there was a void that was growing and spider webbing. And so that, when you read the book, if anyone reads it, you'll recognize that in the monster. That is sort of what it is. This weird, shapeless nothingness that spreads and is bad.
Ooh, kind of like devours everything around it.
And like reaching out and grabbing. And in fact, one of the things I realized a little bit after the fact I was kind of inspired by was I saw a video on YouTube, anybody can look this up, of fast motion or accelerated motion footage of slime mold growing and how it like reaches out pseudopods and tentacles, and watching that really, quickly was like, wow, that's really weird.
Ooh, yeah. That does lead to a good monster, though.
Yeah,
So,
hope so. Fingers
uh,
crossed.
with the world building, did you stick with kind of like the concept of what the environment around you and the lake there looks like?
Yeah, very much so. The city and the area that the story is set in, Golden Oaks, California, on the shores of Oro Lake, California. It's all made up.
Okay.
It's an environment I created. I wouldn't say out of whole cloth. It's created for the story, but the lake is very much like that lake that I described. It's just up the hill here. It's got shadows of Lake Tahoe as well. That sort of area in the Sierra Nevadas. The town Golden Oaks,
Hmm.
very much inspired by Jackson, California, and I think Lockford, California.
Hmm.
My in-laws lived in Jackson for years, which is up right at the edge of the Sierras. And we spent a lot of time going to visit them up there and kind of poking around. It's this funny old, like, gold rush era city. So it's kind of
Ooh.
got this old, weird kind of gothic old feel to it, but yet it's very modern. There's a 76 gas station here, a Safeway over there, and then this building that's been there since the 1800s.
Ooh.
So
I like that you've tied the realistic stuff into it. Let's go ahead and talk more about the characters. Who do you have one specific main character, or is it a couple of them?
it's sort of an ensemble cast. I would say there are probably four main characters. There's Gabe and Laurie Barnes, who are the parents of this family. There's Kimmy, who's the teenage daughter, and then there's Officer Shauna Lasher, who's
Hmm.
a police officer in town, who kind of gets involved in the investigation. As weird things start happening in town, people start disappearing. She's looking into it. The paths keep crossing, and so those are the four main characters, and a few side characters that come in for a chapter or two, and then don't come back,
Yeah. And
or I should say, are removed from the story.
you mentioned in the document that Shauna was supposed to kind of be a throwaway character. How did she finagle her way into becoming more?
She was a very strong personality. She did not want to be ignored. She comes in, like, literally. I think I mentioned in that thing I wrote for you. She came in one scene. A fight breaks out between the main character, not the main character, the father character, Gabe, who actually started as the main character. I should say. It was funny. The whole
Mhm.
book was going to be from his perspective, and then everyone else had things to say, and I couldn't shut up these characters. So Gabe gets into a fight in the parking lot,
Yeah.
um, and the police officer Shauna comes to break it up and make everyone go the way they're supposed to go. And then she needed to come back a little bit later. When one of the guys was dragged to jail, I had something going on with her there, and then she kept having questions, and so yeah, she was meant to be in that one scene and then go away. And
Mm.
then I just kept coming. She was fun to write. She's a very strong personality, and she clearly was not going to let me write the story without her in it.
Hey, they can be very demanding. Would
Yeah.
you say that she is maybe your favorite from the story, or was another your favorite character?
Oh man, I like her a lot. She was a lot of fun to write. Uh, Gabe and Laurie, the parents in the group, they were fun as well. But I think I really did have a lot of fun writing Sean's story. There's another character, Charlie Gaines, who's really only in for a couple chapters as well,
Hmm.
and I really enjoyed writing him. He again sort of shows up and then shuffles off stage. But the scene, he gets one chapter essentially to himself when he's not surrounded by other characters. And writing him was sort of like, oh, this guy showed up and he's going for a walk and he's thinking about his life. And then I got to sort of create a little chapter's worth of backstory for him, before things go sour.
Ooh. Did
But
you find?
Shauna,
Yeah,
I'm
go
sorry.
ahead. No,
I was
go
saying,
ahead.
in answer to your question, yeah, I think Shauna was probably my favorite character to write.
Awesome. Do you do backstories for your characters as they come, or do you prep them ahead of time?
I do most of it as I write.
Okay.
Uh, I might come up with a few key points. What's this person's job? You know, what do they look like a little bit here and there? But I tend to be, what we call a pantser. I like to write, start writing and see where it goes. The phrase I often use is, I'm writing the story to find out what happens. And if I've tried outlining, in fact, I think one of the reasons why it took me so long to really start getting into fiction was because I tried doing those excessive outlines for a story. And every time I do one, I'd get to the end and feel like, well, now I know what happens. I'm not interested anymore. I'm done. Now you want me to write it again, but even longer? No, I'm moving on to the next thing. So
Yeah. It sounds kind of like you're more of a discovery writer that way, discovering how it's going to end, who the character is going to be, how they're going to fall into place as you go. I kind of write like that, but I've been doing like a rough outline. It's not like the permanent outline, but like an idea of like what's going to happen. I feel like my endings always change from what I write down. So it's kind of entertaining. Have you found that happen when you start working on a book that the ending decides to change from what you've pictured it to end as?
Sometimes. I know, I've written, oh gosh, I think I just did a count last night. I was wondering, almost 20 short stories in the last couple of years as well. About half of them have been published at this point. I think there's like 6 or 7 more that have been sold and are coming out soon. And that's kind of an interesting difference between writing short stories and long stories. But I bring it up because, in answer to your question, I kind of knew what the ending of the Seething was going to be. I knew how the monster was going to be resolved by the end of the book. I didn't know where the characters were going to be by the end of the story. They could have done anything they wanted to, and they did what happened in the story. There's at least in those short stories 1 or 2 stories where I came up with an idea for an ending. And then I'm like, oh, wow, this is such a great ending. Now I got to write a whole beginning just to get to that point. And so in those cases, it was almost like I had the target and I'm just kind of meandering around until I get to, exactly what it is I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Going through all the different climax and events and everything to get there. Oh, right. I like it. What are some of the differences you've observed between writing short stories and novels?
Well, novels take a lot longer for sure. You have a lot more room to breathe with a novel, I think, obviously. You can meander a little more. When I wrote The Seething, I definitely would write for a couple months. And then I found it was good because, again, since I'm not really 100% sure where I'm going with the story, it was great to write a couple chapters, set it aside, work on a short story to kind of clear my head, and then come back to The Seething and like, okay, I got some better ideas now. I have an idea where this is going. And a lot of times what I found was really kind of interesting, and this is kind of the fun part of the creative process sometimes, is I had set up all those clues already. And I just hadn't consciously figured out, oh, of course, this makes sense. This is where it's supposed to be going now. But it took me some time when I laid out those breadcrumbs for myself to really understand where it was all going. And in the short stories, what I love there is like I have an idea. Like I've got one, came out a few years ago, Desiderium, about a guy who is possessed by an alien entity. And we see the story every once in a while when the possessive thing loses its hold. This guy wakes up, he's like, holy cow, how did I get here? And it's told in the entire story goes over his entire life. It's like a 10-page long story. It goes over his entire life, 50, 60 years, of which he's only conscious for maybe 3 or 4 minutes. He keeps kind of flashing on what is going on, and having these weird fugue states. And that came from an idea of me wondering, what would it be like if you figured out you were actually a character in a film, a movie, and you were only existing in the parts of your life that hadn't been edited out by the editor? You like, holy, hang on, I was, a year ago I was over there, and now it's like right now, and I'm over here. What is going on? So I'm meandering a little bit, tangentializing, as I say. Short stories for me, it's fun because I have like this one simple idea I'd like to explore for a little bit, play with it, and see, what does that do? Whereas the novel, you can stretch it out. You can have multiple ideas and many themes going on.
Ooh. Do you prefer one over the other?
At this point, I really don't. I've enjoyed doing them both. I've likened them. I mentioned earlier I took up trail running a while ago. I haven't actually done it in about a year or so, foot injury. But I started it around the same time I was doing all these projects, and I really found a connection there. A novel is like running a long distance, 5 or 10K, Whereas a short story is like, I'm just going to go for a quick run around the neighborhood, just get my head clear. And so I think they both are a lot of fun. And I'm happy to keep doing both of them as long as people keep wanting to read these things.
Mm-hmm. That
Even
is
then,
always
probably,
good.
yeah.
When did you know you wanted to be an author? Because I know we mentioned that you came up with stories and ideas when you were younger, but when did you decide to go for it?
Well, it's been something that I really wanted to do for a long time, but there was that leap of faith that I kind of had to take. Because again, I told stories, I fiddled with stories here and there. And honestly, in some ways, somebody took that leap of faith in me, which was kind of interesting. My first novel, In the Belly of the Beast and Other Tales of Cthulhu Wars, it was a combination short story collection, and then the second third of the book is this 80,000 word novel. Was inspired by, based on the Cthulhu Wars board game. It's a post-apocalyptic Lovecraftian horror board game. The publisher of the game had asked me to do a little bit of content work for the rule book. Could you help out with this a little bit? Oh, and we know you like to write short stories. Could you write like a little quick short story for the introduction to the rule book to set the tone? Yeah, sure. 500 words. That sounds fun. And they liked that a lot, right? So then they said, well, hey, we've got like a rules card for each army. If you're playing a different army in the game, every player gets their own little card with the rules. We have all this extra space on the back of the card. Could you write a short story to set the tone for each one of those factions, right? So each one had its own feel. Each one was based on one of the gods of the H.P. Lovecraft Cthulhu mythos. And so so I wrote these little short stories. And they said, hey, we really like that a lot. It just kept going, right? We like those. Could you write a 2,000 word story for each of these armies? And we're going to use them. I think the original idea was to they were designed to be written, they were written to be put onto like a single page of a magazine, right? And there was going to be a short story here. And then opposite that was going to be an ad for the game. So it was going to be a marketing collateral. Like, yeah, sure, 2,000 words. And I get to write, a weird thing about, a Wendigo eating people's tongues or something, who knows? And so we wrote I did all those. And then they're like, well, while we're at it, would you be interested in writing a novel for this thing? And that was that was where the fear came in, right? It's like, okay, a novel, that sounds like a big deal. But I just said, yes, I'm totally going to do it. Let's go for it. And so I did. And they didn't do those advertisements. What they ended up doing was taking those 2,000 word stories and putting them as the first part of this book. So it's like, I think 8 or 9 of these short stories, which sort of set the tone for the world, explain how the world is collapsing into this monstrous anarchy. And then the novel takes place as the game is beginning. And so, it was funny. Like I said, I'd always wanted to write a novel. I never really had enough faith in myself that I could do it. But then this project came along. I always joke that it was sort of like a copywriting gig that suffered from extreme scope creep. They just kept getting bigger and bigger. But after I proved to myself once that I could do it, then I decided to keep going.
Ooh, that's a really cool opportunity that you got to do that.
I'm very fortunate. Yeah.
With your regular writing routine outside of like doing that project back in the day, how do you go about setting goals for the different stories you create?
Well, that's a good question. When writing stories, I'm usually, some of these have been pieces where I was invited to write something for a book. A lot of them are just open submissions. I see, I follow a lot of different publishers and Facebook groups and stuff where they put out calls for stories. And I see something that strikes my fancy. I start writing it and just, work on it. A few hundred words a day if I can. Sometimes the writing goes better than other days. I've had days where I've written almost an entire short story in one day just because it was going so well. And sometimes, even if I'm enjoying it and it's going well, maybe in my life, I just don't have the time to focus, an entire afternoon on writing that day, between being a dad, having kids, being a husband, a day job and all that. You sometimes have to figure out where you can sneak in a little bit of time here and there. And that is, again, one of the fun things I like about writing a novel is that's something I can always say, okay, I'm just going to stop here for now. and I'm going to come back to it in a few days, a week, a month, however long I've got, before I need to get back to it.
Ooh. Another question for you. Speaking of family, does your family support your writing dreams? What are some of the things they do to encourage you to keep it up?
Yeah, they do. I admit, my wife does not read horror, so she hasn't read much of what I've written, but she seems supportive of it. She likes seeing the books come out, and we always get a little excited.
Yeah.
One of the traditions I started with my kids a couple of years ago, in fact, I want to make more of this, is whenever I hit a big milestone, finish a novel or something. When I finished the Cthulhu Wars, when I finished the Seething, when I sold the Seething, we just go out for a big ice cream party. We'll go to the local ice creamery over the hill there. Let's go have sundaes or root beer floats or something, And it's like something you could do anytime anyway, but it's just kind of fun. It's little milestones. Yeah, they're very supportive.
What decision led to you celebrating milestones like that?
Writing, it's a pretty solitary occupation. And in many jobs, other careers of any sort, you can see something that happened. You have a physical thing. I made a widget. I moved stuff from here to there. I, produced a thing. And in writing, you go, hey, I finished 10 chapters. Like, okay, well, but nobody knows but you, and it's exciting to you.
Yeah.
And so I found it was just kind of fun to get everyone else in on it as well. If nothing else, just to let them know, for me, this is a big deal. Hey, I finished an entire book. I finished another book. I did this, and it's also kind of an excuse for me to let people know what I did without, I'm kind of bragging about it, I guess, but without feeling like I'm bragging about it. Like, hey, I'm really happy for myself. Let's go celebrate,
Yeah, no, it's important to celebrate those wins. So.
Right. And again, it doesn't have to be anything huge. You don't go buy yourself a new car or something. Let's go have ice cream cones. Yay.
Yeah, no, that's I feel like a reasonable celebration because, we don't all have like bukus of money. So that's one thing about the writing world is, as an author, you don't make a ton of money unless you are super established and are just like constantly plugging away, which can be exhausting and overwhelming.
I'm sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Which, speaking of overwhelm and exhaustion, what is something you do for self-care to keep yourself from becoming burnt out or getting writer's block?
Well, again, part of it for me when I'm writing is it really helps to not plan too far ahead. I mentioned that earlier. I like to come to the page excited to wonder what's going to happen next. I mean, it's sort of like, to me, when I'm writing, it's almost like I'm watching a movie unveil in my head. And so if I pause at certain times, almost like watching an old chapter serial back in the 30s, those old Rocket Man movies and stuff, I really want to know what happens next. So a lot of times when I'm writing, if the writing has been going well, I might even stop at a cliffhanger moment. So, I'm just going to pause here and I'm going to come back to this tomorrow because I really want to find out what happens next. But I know if I push it another few hundred words, then I will have resolved that and not be so excited. I'll be into the next part, the next day, that'll be fine. But letting myself come back excited. But outside of writing, I still really make time to get out of the house, go for walks around the neighborhood, just get a change of scenery. Still like to go hiking in the hills, go to a movie once in a while. It doesn't have to be any, again, if we're talking money stuff here, it doesn't need to be an expensive, extravagant vacation. There was a book, it was pretty popular years ago, The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron.
Yes, I've read that and done the morning pages and everything. Yeah.
Right. I love the artist date things that she does. Go out and just do something. Do something semi-creative, not necessarily related to what you're doing. If you're writing, maybe paint a picture. If you're painting, maybe write a poem. But get out, take yourself out and give yourself the ability to be creative in a different way. In fact, that makes me think when COVID happened and we all got stuck at home,
Mhm.
I picked up an old hobby, which was painting, building and painting monster model kits, Draculas and Frankensteins and stuff.
Yeah.
And it started just because I remember building those as a kid and having a lot of fun with them. But at the same time, when my kids were doing distance learning, we were all stuck in the house. I really wanted to sort of model kits, whatever, uh,
Mhm.
the behavior of doing creative things that didn't involve staring at a screen. You know,
Yeah.
put down the computers and paint a picture or draw something or, something different.
Hmm.
So that was a
That's,
lot of fun.
yeah. And teaching kids that there's more to doing creative tasks and enjoying things outside of the screen is extremely important with how much screen time kids on average get these days.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Um, which, speaking of taking a break and like focusing on your health, um, what does success look like for you?
Oh boy, that's funny. It's a question that's come up a little bit recently. um, you know, I do have a dream, a goal of someday, doing writing fiction as a full-time career. I would love to be making even just a simple middle-class income doing that. It's
Yeah.
not there yet. Hopefully someday that would be great. If I could just really focus on telling my stories, that would be awesome. For now, really, I just get happy knowing that people are reading the stories and enjoying them on some level. Um, I, a couple years ago, actually, I had posted a free zombie story that I wrote a long time ago. I put it on Amazon. I think it was like The Walking Dead was coming back. And so I posted it for free for the weekend. Hey, anybody wants it, download it, read it, you know, happy zombie day.
Yeah.
And I got a tweet from a woman pretty shortly after that. She was saying that she saw it, she downloaded it. She was in the waiting room of her doctor's office waiting to get some really bad news, apparently. And she said for 15 minutes while she was waiting, she was completely in the world of the story and out of her head and out of being worried about this procedure that was happening. And for me, that was like, that's why I wrote it.
Yes.
If you're taken out of your head, and again, it's post-apocalypse zombie story, guts munching and eyeballs popping all over the place. But it gave her, when she was really stressed out, something different to think about for a few minutes. To me, that was really neat. That was a successful story.
I love hearing stories like that because a lot of them are out there, but there's also like people don't talk about them. But that's like one of the main reasons I feel like a lot of us write is to inspire somebody or help them like just take a break from
Right,
life. Yeah.
right.
And that is amazing that your story was able to do that.
I think so.
Do you think did you ever come in contact with her again on any other stories?
Not that I remember.
Mhm.
But it was such a strong moment for me that it's stuck in my head for all these years since then.
Yeah, that's amazing. Back to the writing idea, do you have some themes that are recurring that tend to show up in your work?
Well, that's a good question. I would imagine, boy, if I'm trying to think over a bunch of different things, a lot of things that come up are people kind of worried about their current situation.
Mhm.
One of my favorite types of stories to read, uh, especially horror stories. One thing I should say is I tend to think of horror not as a genre, but as a storytelling style. Um, I've always thought it's interesting that horror is one of the only styles of fiction that's named for an emotion. You feel horror, you experience horror. You don't feel action or science fiction. Arguably romance, but I haven't read enough romance to really have a good opinion about that. So I'm going to leave that for the experts. um, so one of my favorite types of horror to read, and I think I got it to it in the Seething, is the type of horror where it's regular people dealing with their regular lives,
Yeah.
and then something terrible comes along, and something terrible that nobody else could experience. My favorite example of this that I use frequently, actually, when I talk about this, is Stephen King's Pet Sematary. You've got this family that they've just started their life over. The dad got a new job as the hospital physician. Mom's doing mom stuff, and then they experience it's regular people. You could relate to any of them. There's the new guys that moved across the street. There's the doctor and the mom and the two kids. They're just regular folks. And then the kid dies, right? The kid runs into the street. Spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't read this book that was published 40 years ago. Kid runs in the street, is hit by a truck. It's tragic. And so you've got this thing where this regular family is dealing with probably the worst thing that could happen to a family, right? And then these ghosts, these Wendigo monsters show up and start making everything worse. And you start to see the psychological spiraling of all the characters in the family. And so that's kind of maybe one of the themes that I go for is regular people having regular lives, and then things completely spiral out of control.
Ooh, that is such a good, it's a good theme to have, because there's so much play area with that.
Right.
What would you say was the most challenging story that you've created?
Oh boy. So I keep looking up here. Anybody wondering why Ben's looking up? Because I've got my books on my writing desk right here, so I could look and see some things. Just kind of jog my memory.
Like, okay, which one is the hardest? I look up just to think in general, so yeah.
So looking at all these guys here, one that actually did kind of throw me it was fun. It threw me for a loop. But I was super enthusiastic to write it. I had a great time writing it. Was a story I wrote a couple summers ago, I guess about a year ago, called The Patchwork Man, which is essentially, I'm going to spoil the twist here. Anybody who hasn't read it yet wants to. It's the Frankenstein monster in the Old West. And so I was writing this thing, and I've been reading a lot of Westerns at the time, and a call came up for a Weird Western collection. Weird Western, for those who aren't familiar, is essentially it's a very popular right now storytelling genre of horror Western, monsters in the Old West mashed up. And so this idea hit me like a ton of bricks. Frankenstein in the Old West, that would be a lot of fun. But it was the first thing I've written where I was really writing about somebody else's character. So it was trying to tell this story that the story I was trying to tell. And I knew where I wanted to go, but being respectful to the groundwork that Mary Shelley had laid, 200 some odd years ago, as well as many other iterations of the Frankenstein character in films and books and such. So that one, I wouldn't even say it was a difficult story to write, but I think I put a lot of thought into, am I getting the character right here? Because it's not my character. It's Frankenstein monster at this point. It's everyone's character.
Mm-hmm.
So.
That's cool that you tied Frankenstein in. Have you heard of splatter westerns by chance?
Yeah, I can't remember. Is it Grindhouse Press is doing all those? They have like a whole series of books of these things. I read a few of them. Yeah, they were fun.
I think it is them. I'm not sure. I've read a few of them, but I can't remember which publishing house. One of my friends that I went to college with wrote a story for them for that, the splatter westerns. So that just seems like something that would kind of be like your alley, especially with you going into westerns and doing horror. Have you thought about doing that?
Oh yeah. In fact, actually the Patchwork Man, that short story, I loved it so much. I want to continue. I want to write more short stories about him. And in fact, here, I'm just going to bring the book down. This was the book, Blood on the Soil, Terror in the Wind, was billed as a collection of splatter westerns from Bridget's Gate Press, the same people publishing the Seething. And so that was kind of funny also because I'm not a huge splatter reader. And so I found myself having to, I think I mentioned this very early on, that I kind of use gore as punctuation. But with the Patchwork Man, I really had to kind of push the envelope a little bit. So in some ways, he's kind of more of a Hammer horror version of Frankenstein as opposed to the Universal Pictures version of Frankenstein.
Yeah. And splatter western is so different than a lot of gory novels. It's because I normally kind of shy away from more of the gory stuff.
Right.
But for some reason, it didn't bother me as much. And maybe it's just because it was tying in other aspects, kind of like what you've mentioned you do for the story.
Sure.
So in the little chat sheet we've got, you mentioned working on a Star Wars project.
I did.
So let's dive into that. Share more of like what you did and how you got into that.
I worked on Star Wars, the original Star Wars. Can you tell? Because I'm so old. No, no. I did work on Star Wars, the extended edition. So in college, I was a film major, and my emphasis in film was on writing and directing. So a lot of the classes I was taking were on screenwriting,
Yeah.
and they also asked us to do some breadth stuff. So I took some creative writing classes, some classes on mythology and folklore, which was really kind of my interest in film. That's a whole other conversation. But my last semester of college, I applied for and scored an internship at Industrial Light and Magic, which was just up the road here from me, right, since I'm still in the Bay Area. And it just happened that when I was at ILM, they were getting started on what they call the special editions of the original trilogy of films. They were cleaning up some effect shots and adding new stuff into it. They put Jabba the Hutt back into the movie. If you ever saw the original cut, Jabba was not in there. They couldn't figure out how to make it work in 1976. And so I was in the feature editorial department, which is the department that controlled all the film pieces that the special effects guys were doing. And I ended up getting this job because my supervisor figured out what a huge Star Wars nerd I was. Apparently I'd hit it well enough that they decided to let me into the company for a little while anyway. And then they found out when I got there what a huge Star Wars dork I am. And so I had this job, among my other things I had to do was they gave me photocopies of the original storyboards showing all the effect shots with time codes listed on each thing. And I had to go match those up to a video cassette they had. So this time code becomes this. And then I would go into the original, the negative vault, which is, imagine like that scene in the Raiders of the Lost Ark, when he goes in the back and you've got all the artifacts stuck there and the things. That was basically like, they call it the O-Neg vault, the original negative vault at the Skywalker, Kerner Labs.
Yeah.
The negative film strips of every piece of footage ILM had ever shot in a temperature controlled vault. And I would have to go in there, track down the time coded film strip to bring back, to match up to the thing, to, tag all these things, bring it to the editorial department. And then they would go through and digitize those pieces of film and then send them off to the effects guys who are then going to, clean up Obi-Wan Kenobi's lightsaber or, fix this matte painting. Or there's the scene at the end of the movie where they're coming around Yavin 4 toward the Death Star and they replaced all the model X-Wings with CGI X-Wings. So that was what I was doing there at ILM. That was fun.
Wow, that is really cool. And also that sounds like it was a ton of work. So
it was. But it was fun
worth
work,
it, but
yeah, absolutely.
Oh man, because now you put on the paper and you get to kind of like brag about being part of the crew that helped create that into a better version of itself.
Well, some say it's not a better version, but it was definitely the modernized version of it,
Yeah,
I think it's fine.
There's probably always going to be argument on that. It's kind of similar to like almost like the retelling of or not really retelling, like changing, but like a. You know what I mean? It's like I can't do that. Like say it without adding in, and I don't want them to flag
editorializing. Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I think it was Leonardo da Vinci who was quoted once as saying that a piece of art is never finished; it's simply abandoned, and that was sort of what Lucas was doing for many years. He's like, I got another idea. I want to go back and fix this. And at some point, I guess he sold the whole thing to Disney, and that was when he abandoned it and moved on. But he kept coming up with ideas how to change stuff, how to fix stuff, and yeah, nice. It's his movie. He can do what he wants, right?
That is true. That is true. It's his creation. Oh. Well, Ben, thank you so much for being on the show today. Go ahead and tell our listeners where they can find you and your work.
Well, it's a very complicated website name I've got. It's benmonroe.com, spelled just like it sounds. So you can find basically anything about me there. You can find links to my social media, which I'm mostly active on Twitter and Facebook, but you can find links to it there. There are links to all my books on there. There are links to different podcasts, interviews, and things I've done. This one will be listed on there as well. You can also go to Bridget's Gate Press and take a look for my book, The Seething, as well as a lot of other stuff. They've got a ton of great books they've put out recently, more coming out. The Seething, I'm not sure when this podcast will launch, but The Seething will be available as of March 23rd. Anywhere you buy books, you can get it through the Ingram Spark program, they call it. So if you don't want to buy it from one of the big booksellers, go to your local indie neighborhood bookseller, give them the title, The Seething, my name, Ben Monroe. And if they need the ISBN, you can find that somewhere. But it's available anywhere you buy books.
Ooh, awesome. Well, thank you again for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Make sure you hit the like and subscribe button. Check out Ben's books. Check out mine as well. Don't forget, you can find everything on my website. And yeah, Ben, we've reached the end. So
yay. Well, it's nice talking to you.
I hope you enjoyed the show. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to get future notifications when shows come out. Also, be sure to check out my website. I have a blog featuring this creative with some other fun and interesting questions. You can also subscribe to my newsletter there to stay up to date with all things the Chapter Goddess and Madilynn Dale. Once again, thanks for watching and have a great rest of the day.